"Please, Mr. Montgomery, don't throw her drawings away," Clara whispered, her raw red knuckles clutching the silver trash bin. Sebastian Montgomery, the city's most feared billionaire, froze, his gaze dropping from the crumpled, crayon-smudged paper in his hand to the tiny, worn-out orthopedic shoes of Clara's silent 6-year-old daughter standing in the doorway. The dawn at 894 Stony Brook Lane always smelled of lavender wax and cold stone. By 5 a.m., the heating vents in the massive Georgian manor had not yet breathed their warm air, leaving the floorboards icy beneath Clara's knees. She didn't mind the cold. She minded the quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a house built on old money, new secrets, and the sharp, invisible lines drawn between those who owned the marble and those who scrubbed it. Clara adjusted the faded wool cardigan around her shoulders, her fingers lingering on a loose thread. She had bought it at a thrift shop off 4th Avenue 3 winters ago, back when her husband was still alive, before the medical bills from St. Jude's Children's Hospital had swallowed their savings whole, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of debt and a quiet, watchful daughter named Lily. Lily sat on the bottom step of the back staircase, her tiny feet tucked under her skirt. She was 6, but she carried the stillness of someone much older. Beside her sat a plastic yellow lunchbox. Inside, Clara knew, was only a cup of plain white rice and 3 carefully sliced carrots, all Clara could afford after paying the monthly premium for Lily's corrective leg braces. "Keep your head down today, sweet pea," Clara whispered, her voice barely a rustle against the grand staircase. "The master of the house is hosting his sister's engagement dinner tonight. The family from the south side is coming." Lily nodded, her large blue eyes reflecting the dim morning light. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken a single word since the night her father died in the factory fire. Instead, she drew. She drew on the backs of receipts, on the margins of old newspapers, and on the scrap paper Clara salvaged from the recycling bins of the wealthy. By 8 a.m., the manor was awake. The smell of frying pancetta and imported espresso filled the state-of-the-art kitchen. Standing at the center of the chaos was Sebastian Montgomery. At 38, Sebastian was a man carved from granite. His reputation as a ruthless hedge fund titan, and, as the whispers in the dark alleys of Chicago suggested, the undisputed boss of the Northern Syndicate, preceded him. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, every seam flawless, yet his eyes were dark, tired, and shielded by an impenetrable wall of steel. His sister, Beatrice, sat at the marble island, her delicate fingers wrapping around a porcelain cup. Beatrice was beautiful in the way expensive things are, fragile, polished, and demanding of constant care. She was marrying Dominic Rossi tonight. The Rossi family controlled the southern shipping docks, and the marriage was less of a romance and more of a treaty. Everyone in their circle knew the Rossis looked down on Sebastian's rapid rise, but they needed his capital. "We need the silver polished again, Clara," Beatrice sighed, not looking up from her tablet. "And make sure the girl stays in the carriage house today. Dominic's family doesn't need to see distractions." Clara kept her eyes on the floor, her hands clasped behind her back to hide the raw, cracked skin of her palms. "Yes, Miss Montgomery. I will ensure Lily remains out of sight." And the floor in the West Gallery, Sebastian's deep baritone cut through the room, making the silver spoons on the counter vibrate. He didn't look at Clara. He was staring at a folder of financial documents, his jaw tight. "It's dull. Fix it before 5. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery," Clara said softly. She turned and walked toward the utility closet, her chest tightening. She spent the next 7 hours on her knees. The harsh scent of lemon ammonia stung her eyes, and the rough bristles of the scrubbing brush bit into her knuckles, reopening the small cuts from the day before. But she didn't stop. Every stroke of the brush was $1 toward Lily's next physical therapy session. Every ache in her lower back was a shield keeping the cold world away from her daughter. At noon, Clara slipped out to the carriage house to check on Lily. The small room above the garage was drafty, but Clara had made it a home with mismatched blankets and a small, flickering space heater. Lily was sitting on the floor, her colored pencils scattered around her. She was drawing a portrait of a man. The lines were remarkably precise for a child, a sharp jawline, deep-set, sorrowful eyes, and a small, faint scar near the temple. Clara gasped softly. It was Sebastian. "Lily, sweetie," Clara said, kneeling beside her. "Why are you drawing, Mr. Montgomery?" Lily touched her own chest, then pointed to the window overlooking the main house. She held up her drawing, her eyes pleading for her mother to understand. Before Clara could ask further, the heavy oak door of the carriage house creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Sebastian himself, holding a leather portfolio. He stopped, his imposing frame nearly blocking out the light. His eyes swept over the sparse room, taking in the frayed blankets, the tiny space heater, and the single half-empty bowl of rice on the small table. His gaze lingered on Lily's worn-out, orthopedic shoes which sat near the door, their leather cracked and scuffed. "The kitchen staff said you weren't at your station, Clara," Sebastian said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I'm sorry, sir," Clara said, rising quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I just came to check on Lily. I was returning immediately." Sebastian's eyes drifted to the floor, landing on the drawing Lily had just finished. Lily, with the fearless innocence of a child, didn't hide it. Instead, she held it up to him. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the ruthless billionaire slipped. Sebastian's jaw slackened, and his hand gripped his portfolio so tightly the leather groaned. He looked at the drawing, then at Lily's quiet, expectant face. A dark shadow of pain crossed his features, a look of deep, buried guilt that Clara had never seen on him before. "Keep her out of the main house tonight," Sebastian said, his voice suddenly husky and strained. He turned on his heel and walked out, slamming the door behind him. By 6 p.m., the grand driveway of 894 Stony Brook Lane was lined with black town cars. The elite of the city poured into the ballroom, their diamonds gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. Clara worked tirelessly in the shadows, carrying trays of champagne, clearing empty glasses, her ears buzzing with the superficial laughter of the wealthy. She watched as Dominic Rossi, a tall, arrogant man with a cruel smile, stood with his family. His sister, Gemma, sat in a velvet armchair. Gemma was a heavy-set woman, her frame filling the designer silk gown she wore. The silence in the ballroom stretched so thin it felt as though the crystal chandeliers above might shatter. Sebastian stood frozen, the crumpled drawing in one hand and his eyes locked onto the yellowed envelope, held in Lily's small, trembling fingers. "Where did you find this, Clara?" Sebastian's voice was no longer the cold, authoritative command of a boss. It was cracked, vulnerable, stripped of all its armor. Clara stood up, holding Lily close to her chest, the little girl's cheek pressed against her mother's shoulder, her eyes wide and silent. It was in my husband's old metal lockbox, Mr. Montgomery," Clara stammered, her voice shaking under the weight of 100 wealthy eyes staring at her. "Thomas kept very few things from his time working at the Montgomery shipping yard on the south side. He told me it was a letter of recommendation. I never opened it. Lily must have found it in the bottom drawer of our dresser." Sebastian stepped closer, his boots heavy against the hardwood floor. He took the envelope from Lily's hand. His fingers brushed against the child's small, cold palm, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes, as if feeling a jolt of electricity. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of parchment. As his eyes scanned the elegant, sweeping cursive of his late father, Sebastian's face drained of what little color it had left. Dominic Rossi stepped forward, his silk suit rustling, his expression a mix of irritation and amusement. "Sebastian, what is the meaning of this drama? We are in the middle of celebrating your sister's future. Why are we pausing for a maid's old trash?" Sebastian didn't look at him. "This trash," Sebastian whispered, "is my father's handwritten will. The real one." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Beatrice took a step back, her face turning white. The will that was read after his death 5 years ago left 50% of the shipping company to the Rossi family to clear a debt, Sebastian said, his eyes still glued to the paper. But this says there was no debt. My father writes that he discovered the Rossis were smuggling illegal cargo through our docks. He wrote this to document the truth, and he gave it to his most trusted foreman, Thomas, to keep safe in case anything happened to him. Sebastian slowly raised his eyes to look at Dominic. The dark, terrifying boss of the Northern Syndicate had returned, but this time his anger was cold, calculated, and absolute. My father didn't die of a heart attack, Dominic, and Thomas didn't die in an accidental factory fire. The implication hung in the air like a heavy fog. Dominic's smile vanished completely, replaced by a defensive, angry glare. This is absurd. A forged letter held by a mute child of a dead worker? You expect anyone to believe this? I believe it. A quiet, steady voice broke the tension. Everyone turned. It was Gemma Rossi. She stood up from her velvet armchair, her heavy frame moving with a quiet, deliberate grace. She walked past her brother, ignoring his furious glare, and stood before Sebastian. "Gemma, shut up and sit down," Dominic hissed, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. But Gemma swatted his hand away with surprising strength. She looked directly at Sebastian. "Our father always talked about the Montgomery debt, but there were never any receipts, Sebastian. No bank transfers, only late-night meetings and whispered conversations. I have the ledger from those years, the shipping manifests. I kept them because I knew one day the truth would have to be told." The ballroom erupted into hushed, chaotic whispering. The power dynamic in the room had instantly shifted. The Rossis, who had entered the manor believing they held the Montgomerys by the throat, were suddenly standing on a crumbling ledge. And Gemma, the ridiculed, silent sister, had just handed Sebastian the hammer to shatter them. Dominic lunged toward his sister, his face contorted in rage. "You fat, useless traitor!" Before his hand could make contact, Sebastian's fist connected with Dominic's jaw. The sound of the impact echoed through the hall. Dominic spun and fell hard onto the floor, his nose bleeding onto the white marble. "Get out of my house," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "All of you, except Gemma." The guests scrambled for the doors, their expensive gowns rustling as they fled the impending storm. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was empty, save for Sebastian, Beatrice, Gemma, Clara, and Lily. Dominic dragged himself up, wiping the blood from his face, and sneered at his sister. "You're dead to the family, Gemma. You have nothing." "She has everything," Sebastian said, stepping in front of Gemma, "because tomorrow she is taking your place at the head of the Rossi shipping division, and she is doing it with the full backing of the Montgomery Syndicate." Dominic spit on the floor and stumbled out into the rainy night, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Beatrice looked at her brother, tears streaming down her face. "Sebastian, the wedding, the alliance." "The alliance is over, Beatrice," Sebastian said quietly. "Go to your room." Beatrice fled up the stairs, her sobbing echoing through the high ceilings. Clara stood by the doorway, still holding Lily tightly. She felt out of place, an intruder in a war of giants. "Mr. Montgomery, I should take Lily back to the carriage house. I am so sorry for the disruption." "No, Clara, stay," Sebastian said. He walked over to where they stood. The fierce, terrifying man who had just leveled a rival family now looked incredibly small. He looked down at Lily, who was watching him with her quiet, intelligent eyes. Sebastian slowly sank to one knee, bringing himself eye to eye with the little girl. He looked at her worn-out shoes, then at her face. "Your father was a good man, Lily," Sebastian said, his voice cracking. "He tried to protect my father, and he died because of it. I didn't know. I thought he had abandoned us. I thought he took the money and ran." A single tear escaped Sebastian's eye, tracing a path down his rugged cheek. He took Lily's small hand in his. "I have spent 5 years living in the dark, believing everyone was my enemy. But your father was the only one who stayed loyal." Lily reached out with her other hand. Gently, she wiped the tear from Sebastian's cheek. She didn't speak, but her touch spoke volumes. It was a gesture of pure, unconditional forgiveness. Sebastian closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking slightly as he held the child's hand. Gemma walked over, her expression soft and compassionate. She looked at Clara, then at Lily. They have been living in the carriage house, Sebastian. In the cold, the east wing of the manor was a sanctuary of gilded mirrors and velvet drapes, but to Clara it felt like a beautiful cage. For the first time in 5 years, she did not wake up to the biting scent of ammonia. Instead, the air in her new bedroom was sweet with the fragrance of fresh jasmine, and the hearth crackled with a warm, steady fire. Yet habits born of survival do not die easily. Clara spent her first morning in the east wing smoothing the silk sheets with her rough, calloused hands, obsessively tucked and folded until the corners were mathematically perfect. She couldn't help it. When you have spent years expecting the floor to be pulled from beneath you, you learn to tread as lightly as possible. At 10 o'clock, Dr. Kenneth Miller from Mercy Hospital arrived. Sebastian had summoned him personally. Clara stood quietly in the corner of the sun-drenched parlor, her chest tight as the distinguished doctor gently examined Lily's legs. Lily sat on a plush velvet ottoman, her tiny hands gripping her sketchpad, her eyes darting nervously between the doctor and her mother. The muscle atrophy in the left calf is significant, but not irreversible, Doctor, Miller said, adjusting his glasses as he looked up at Sebastian, who stood by the window with his arms crossed. With the right orthopedic surgery and intensive daily physical therapy, she won't need these heavy braces in a year. She will run, Mr. Montgomery, just like any other child. Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. A quiet, broken sob escaped her lips. She quickly covered her mouth, embarrassed by her display of emotion in front of the master of the house. But Sebastian didn't look annoyed. He walked over to the ottoman and knelt before Lily. He didn't look like a feared syndicate boss in that moment. The hard lines of his face had softened, and his dark eyes held a gentle, protective warmth. "Did you hear that, Lily?" Sebastian asked softly. "No more heavy metal. You're going to run." Lily looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she turned her sketchpad around. She had drawn a picture of a little girl running through a field of yellow dandelions, holding the hand of a tall, dark-shadowed man. Sebastian's throat moved as he swallowed hard. He gently patted her knee, stood up and looked at Clara. "The surgery is scheduled for next Tuesday," Sebastian said, his tone returning to his businesslike bark, though his eyes remained soft. "I have already transferred the funds to Mercy Hospital. You don't have to worry about bills anymore, Clara. Not ever again." "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery," Clara whispered, her eyes shining with tears. I don't know how I will ever repay you." "You don't owe me anything," Sebastian said quietly, looking down. "Your husband paid the price for this family's safety 5 years ago. I am merely settling a very late ledger." As the afternoon faded into a bruised purple twilight, the atmosphere in the manor grew tense. Gemma Rossi had spent the entire day in the library with Sebastian, surrounded by mountains of financial records, shipping manifests, and old bank ledgers. Clara, unable to sit idle, had brewed a pot of chamomile tea and carried the tray to the library door. As she pushed the door open, she paused. Gemma was sitting at the massive mahogany desk, her spectacles resting on the bridge of her nose. Sebastian stood behind her, leaning over her shoulder as her pen flew across a spreadsheet. "Look here, Sebastian," Gemma said, her voice sharp and filled with a brilliant, calculating intelligence. "Dominic has been routing 20% of the harbor revenue through a shell company registered in Panama under our uncle's name. If we freeze this account, his entire distribution network collapses by midnight. He won't even have the cash flow to pay his enforcers." Sebastian stared at her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "Gemma, you are a genius. For 10 years, the syndicate elders thought you were just a silent observer. They thought I was a fat, useless girl who only cared about pastries," Gemma said, a cold, dry humor in her voice. "So they talked freely in front of me. They left papers on the dining table. They forgot that the quietest person in the room is often the one taking the most notes. Dominic wanted a pawn. Instead, he gave me the keys to his kingdom. They laughed at you, Sebastian murmured, his voice filled with respect. And now you are going to make us untouchable. We are not untouchable yet, Gemma warned, her expression darkening. Dominic is cornered, and a cornered rat will bite. That bite came sooner than anyone expected. Later that evening, Sebastian had to leave for the Drake Hotel for an emergency summit with the syndicate elders to present the original will and Gemma's financial evidence. He took his primary security detail with him, leaving the manor heavily guarded but quiet. The storm that had been brewing all afternoon finally broke, lashing rain against the tall glass windows of the east wing. Clara lay in bed, but sleep refused to come. Every crack of thunder made her jump. Lily was asleep beside her, her small hand clutching the new charcoal pencils Sebastian had bought her. Suddenly, a strange sound drifted through the heating vents. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, sharp click of a heavy lock sliding open. Clara sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The security system at 894 Stony Brook Lane was state-of-the-art. The doors could only be opened from the inside, or with a master key. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. She crept to the door of her suite and cracked it open, peering into the long, dimly lit corridor of the West Gallery. Through the shadows, she saw a figure. It was Beatrice. Sebastian's sister was standing by the side entrance, her face pale and frantic. She was holding the heavy iron door open, and stepping through that door, soaked in rain and smelling of cheap cigarettes and wet wool, was Dominic Rossi. Behind him were two towering men with cold, dead eyes. "Where is it?" Dominic hissed, grabbing Beatrice by the arm. "In the library," Beatrice whimpered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and spite. "In the safe behind the portrait. Just take the ledger and the will and get out of here, Dominic. You promised you wouldn't hurt Sebastian." "Of course I won't, sweetheart," Dominic sneered, throwing her aside. "I'm just going to take back what's mine. And then your brother will have nothing to threaten me with." Clara gasped, quickly pulling her head back behind the door. Her blood ran cold. The narrow service corridor of the east wing was pitch black, smelling of old pine and copper pipes. Clara pressed her back against the cold brick wall, holding Lily so tightly she could feel the rapid, frantic fluttering of the little girl's heart against her chest. Outside, the storm shrieked, rain rattling against the high clerestory windows like handfuls of gravel. Footsteps thudded heavily on the carpeted floor of the hallway they had just vacated. A beam of harsh, white flashlight swept across the floorboards through the crack under the service door. "They're not in the beds," a rough voice growled from the other side. "But the sheets are still warm. They're nearby." Clara squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't run down the spiral stairs. Her knees were trembling so violently they would betray her, and Lily's heavy metal braces would clank against the iron steps like a fire alarm. She had to hide. Desperate, Clara looked around the tiny landing. In the darkness, her hand brushed against the handle of the old dumbwaiter. A relic from the late 1800s used to haul laundry from the upper floors to the basement washroom. It was small, dusty, and suspended by thick, frayed hemp ropes. "Lily," Clara whispered, her lips brushing her daughter's ear. "I need you to get inside. Be as quiet as a little mouse. No matter what you hear, do not make a sound." Lily looked at the dark, narrow wooden shaft, then back at her mother. For a second, terror flared in the child's wide blue eyes, but she saw the desperate, tearful plea in her mother's face. Lily nodded. She crawled into the wooden box, tucking her braced legs against her chest. Clara gently pulled the wooden shutter closed, leaving only a tiny crack for air. Just as the shutter clicked into place, the service door was kicked open. The beam of the flashlight blinded Clara. She gasped, stumbling backward against the dumbwaiter frame as a heavy hand grabbed her by the collar of her nightgown, dragging her out into the dimly lit corridor. Dominic Rossi stood there, his damp hair plastered to his forehead, his jaw bruised and swollen from Sebastian's punch. He looked wild, frantic, and utterly depleted of his usual aristocratic charm. "Where is the brat, Clara?" Dominic snarled, tightening his grip on her collar until she gasped for air. "Where is the letter?" She isn't here," Clara choked out, her fingers clawing at his leather-gloved hand. "I sent her away. She's gone." Dominic slapped her across the face. The force of the blow sent Clara crashing to the floor, her cheek burning, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. "Don't lie to me, you pathetic scrubwoman," Dominic yelled, stepping over her. He kicked open the doors of the linen closets, tossing sheets and blankets onto the floor. "I know she was here. She has the paper. If I don't get that will, my family will strip me of everything by sunrise." From downstairs, the heavy oak entrance doors groaned open. A cold draft swept up the stairwell, carrying the deep, furious roar of Sebastian Montgomery. Dominic froze. His face went pale. He looked at his two enforcers, his eyes darting around the hallway like a cornered animal. "Find the kid," he hissed to his men. "I'll deal with Sebastian." Dominic rushed toward the grand staircase, leaving his two hired thugs in the east wing. One of them, a massive man with a jagged scar across his throat, turned his attention back to Clara. He walked slowly toward her, his heavy boots clicking on the floor. "Let's see if we can make the mother talk," the scarred man muttered, reaching down to grab Clara's hair. But Clara didn't look at him. She looked past him. Standing at the end of the service corridor, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway, was Gemma Rossi. She was not running. She was not hiding. She held a heavy brass fireplace poker in her right hand, her face set in a mask of cold, unyielding fury. Before the scarred man could react, Gemma stepped forward with a speed that defied her size and brought the heavy brass poker down across the man's shoulder. The metal connected with a dull, sickening crack. The man cried out, stumbling backward and releasing Clara. The second enforcer lunged at Gemma, but she didn't flinch. She swung the poker again, catching him squarely in the ribs. He groaned, collapsing against the wall. "Clara, get up!" Gemma gasped, her breath coming in heavy rags as she offered a hand to the maid. Clara grabbed Gemma's hand, pulling herself up. "Lily, she's in the dumbwaiter," Clara whispered, pointing to the wooden shaft. Gemma quickly helped Clara pull the shutter open. Lily crawled out, her face pale but her eyes completely dry. She didn't cry. Instead, she reached into her small pajama pocket and pulled out the yellowed envelope, the true will of Arthur Montgomery. She had kept it safe. "Good girl," Gemma whispered, her eyes shining as she took the envelope. "Now let's go end this." Downstairs in the grand foyer, the scene was chaotic. Sebastian stood near the entrance, his coat soaked with rain, his hands clenched into fists as three of his own security guards held Dominic at gunpoint. Beatrice sat on the bottom step of the stairs, weeping hysterically, her hands covering her face. "You're finished, Dominic," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "The council has seen the digital copies of the ledgers Gemma sent. They've already frozen your accounts. You have no money, no crew, and no harbor. You are nothing. You think you won?" Dominic laughed, a high-pitched, desperate sound. "You don't have the original will, Sebastian. Without the hard copy, my family's lawyers will tie this up in probate court for the next 10 years. You'll never touch the shipping docks." "He doesn't need to wait," Gemma's voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Everyone looked up. Gemma walked down the stairs, her steps slow, measured, and powerful. Beside her was Clara, holding Lily's hand. Lily walked with a slight limp, the heavy metal of her braces clicking against the marble stairs, but her head was held high. Gemma reached the bottom of the stairs and handed the yellowed envelope to Sebastian. "The original will, signed and witnessed," Gemma said, her voice ringing clear through the high ceilings. "And the ledger that proves my brother's treason against both our families." Dominic stared at his sister, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound hatred. "You obese, useless cow. You ruined us." Gemma stepped closer to him. For the first time in her life, she did not look down. She did not shrink under his gaze.